Ethan Davis ran his hand along the smooth wing of the Cessna Citation, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingertips as the early morning sun broke through a thin haze. The regional airstrip was quiet, save for the faint hum of distant engines and the occasional chirping of birds greeting the day. It was a ritual for him, pre-flight checks done with military precision, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Flying was his life, his sanctuary. Every bolt he checked, every gauge he adjusted, reminded him that up there in the sky, he was free. Down here on the tarmac, however, life had a way of complicating things. Ethan stepped back and gave the engine a final look. Everything was running smooth, just as it should be. From under the nose wheel, Rachel Parker, his mechanic and longtime friend, emerged, wiping grease off her hands with a rag tucked into her coveralls. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, some strands escaping to frame her face. She was already smirking, knowing full well that Ethan would double-check everything, even if it meant looking over her work for the 100th time. "Always keeping me on my toes, huh?" Rachel teased, her voice light but sharp. "Someone's got to make sure you don't cut corners," Ethan replied with a grin. He trusted her, more than most. They had a good thing going, working together to keep the small charter business afloat. But he was old school. Old habits from his time in the Air Force didn't die easily, and he liked things done his way, done right. Rachel rolled her eyes, but the smile she gave him said she understood. She knew engines. He knew the skies. Together they made a pretty good team, even if they were scraping by, one flight at a time. Every job was a small victory, a step toward keeping the dream alive. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that today might not go as smoothly as he hoped. As he secured the cargo hatch, Ethan spotted the passengers approaching. There were 4 of them, mid-30s to early 40s, dressed casually but with a stiffness to their gait that immediately caught his attention. They moved like men who were used to being in control, like they expected people to step aside for them. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man with a cold stare and a jagged scar running along his jawline, made eye contact with Ethan. No smile, no handshake, just a slow, almost deliberate nod that felt more like a warning than a greeting. Ethan's gut tightened. Years of combat flying had sharpened his instincts, and something about these men didn't sit right. He couldn't put his finger on it yet, but his pilot's sense of danger was on high alert. "Another corporate run?" Rachel asked as she emerged from underneath the plane, wiping her hands on the rag again. She knew Ethan too well, and the subtle shift in his posture hadn't gone unnoticed. Ethan nodded but didn't say much. "Yeah, shouldn't take more than a couple of hours." Rachel raised an eyebrow. She knew him well enough to see through the calm exterior, but she respected that he didn't let it show. She could sense his unease too. The passengers boarded the plane, and Ethan's gaze followed them, watching their every move. There was something off about them, but he pushed it aside. Clients were clients. He had flown businessmen, celebrities, and a few shady types over the years. It wasn't the first time he'd had a gut feeling that didn't match the situation, but this time felt different. As Ethan settled into the cockpit and flicked the switches, the plane hummed to life, and his mind snapped into the familiar rhythm. The sound of the engines was a comfort, the kind that anchored him to the moment. He glanced over at the passengers as they took their seats. Their eyes lingered too long on the cockpit controls, and his unease only grew. They were sizing him up, not as a pilot, but as something else. He adjusted the throttle, and the plane began to climb, leaving the quiet airstrip behind as the sky stretched out ahead. The steady hum of the engines was the only sound in the cockpit, but the tension in the back of the plane made the air feel heavier than usual. An hour into the flight, Ethan could feel the weight of their gazes on him from the first row. Jack's eyes never left him, sharp and calculating. Ethan focused on the horizon, his hands steady on the yoke, but the tension was thick in the air. "You fly like someone who's been doing this a long time," Jack's voice came from behind, breaking the silence. Ethan kept his gaze on the instruments. "I've had my share of hours." Jack leaned forward, his voice shifting, a little too casual. "I like a man who knows his way around the sky, someone reliable." "I'm just a pilot," Ethan replied, keeping his tone cool, controlled. No one's just anything, Jack countered, leaning in closer. His voice carried a subtle edge now, probing. Ethan's grip tightened on the controls. Something wasn't right. He wasn't in the mood for games. His mind raced ahead, calculating their every move. He wasn't about to let these men pull him into something that could cost him everything. "I don't take jobs off the books," Ethan said firmly, feeling the pressure mount. "FAA regulations are my livelihood." Jack's expression didn't change. His words came slow, deliberate. "Licenses can be replaced, lives can't." The words hit like a punch, but Ethan didn't flinch. He held his ground. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to intimidate him, and it wouldn't be the last. But today was different. He could feel it. "I'm flying this plane," Ethan said, his voice low. "That's what you hired me for." A flight. The silence stretched. Then Jack gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The tension didn't dissipate, but it shifted. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. For the next few minutes, Ethan kept his eyes on the instruments. His mind was calculating every move, every option. They hadn't gone too far yet, but he could feel the walls closing in. This was no longer just a flight. This was a fight, and he wasn't going to lose. Ethan's senses remained razor-sharp as the plane cut through the cloud cover, the familiar hum of the engines grounding him in the present. The controls were second nature. He'd flown this route 1,000 times, but the unease in the back of his mind refused to fade. His fingers tightened on the yoke, but he kept his face neutral, his breathing even. Jack's men, though quiet, had a way of making the air feel thick with menace. Ethan had flown plenty of shady characters over the years, but these men were different. They moved with the confidence of predators, their every action deliberate, as if they knew they had control. "Everything's good up here, Ethan?" Jack's voice came again, smooth but laced with a subtle demand. "I'm fine," Ethan replied, his voice steady. He didn't take his eyes off the instruments. "Smooth ride, no turbulence." A beat of silence followed, and then Jack's voice cut through again, sharper this time. "How long have you been flying, Ethan?" "Long enough," he answered coolly. "I don't trust men who don't talk," Jack said, his tone dropping just a fraction, like a warning. "You ever work for anyone big? Anyone with real connections?" Ethan remained quiet, unwilling to engage. He wasn't here for small talk, but he could feel the weight of Jack's stare on the back of his neck, and his instincts were screaming that something was about to happen. Something he wasn't prepared for. His thoughts raced ahead. The sky was wide, but his margin for error was shrinking. With every passing minute, the threat of what was coming became more real. "You're not just a pilot, are you?" Jack's voice came again, this time with an edge of expectation. Ethan's gut tightened. The question wasn't casual anymore. It was an interrogation. He could feel the tension building, the air thick with unspoken threats. He adjusted the altitude slightly, keeping his hands steady on the yoke, but his mind was running through escape routes, emergency options, anything to gain control of the situation. "I'm just here to fly you where you want to go," Ethan replied, his voice cold and professional. Jack leaned forward from the first row, his eyes narrowing. "I've been in this game long enough to know when a man's hiding something." Before Ethan could respond, there was a sudden shift in the air, a feeling of pressure building. He glanced at the gauges. Everything was still stable, but he could sense the growing unease from the passengers. Their behavior was shifting, becoming more deliberate, more focused. Ethan's instincts kicked into high gear. Suddenly, Kyle, the restless one of the group, shifted forward in his seat. His knee bounced up and down with impatience, and his eyes flicked from the door of the cockpit to the window, as if calculating his next move. Ethan's muscles tensed. He didn't need to look back to know that the other men were watching him carefully. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a subtle signal that he was being boxed in. The easy job he thought he was taking had turned into something much darker. The unease that had been creeping at the edges of his mind now felt like a full-blown alarm. He took a slow, deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, but the air inside the cockpit seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. "Where are we headed, Ethan?" Jack's voice came again, close now, like a snake slithering into his ear. "You're flying this route like you've got it all figured out, But the thing about guys like us, Jack's words trailed off as he leaned in a little closer. We don't like surprises. Ethan didn't flinch. Surprises tend to be overrated, he replied, his tone still controlled. But there was a growing edge to it now. His hands remained steady on the controls, but the tension in the cabin was suffocating. Kyle's knee bounced harder now, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. These men were growing more agitated. Their tight control was slipping. They could feel something in the air, just like Ethan did. This was no longer just a flight. This was a carefully calculated take. The sound of Jack's voice drew Ethan's attention again. It was softer now, but there was an unmistakable threat beneath the calm. I think you're playing us, Ethan. A man like you? You don't just fly charter planes for a living. Ethan's grip tightened ever so slightly on the yoke, his fingers digging into the familiar grooves. I fly because it's what I know. It's what I do. There was a long pause before Jack responded. His voice was colder now, more deliberate. That's not what I'm asking, pilot. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He wasn't about to give them anything they could use against him. He had worked too hard to get to this point. He wasn't going to let a few criminals, no matter how dangerous they looked, push him around. A moment of uncomfortable silence followed, broken only by the low hum of the engines. The steady rhythm should have been reassuring, but now it felt like the calm before a storm. Then, with a suddenness that made Ethan's blood run cold, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The weight of the silence turned sharp, like the moment before a knife hits its mark. He didn't need to look back to know what was happening. He could feel it. Jack and his crew were making their move. Kyle stood up quickly, his boots clicking on the floor. He moved with purpose, eyes locked on Ethan, like a wolf stalking its prey. Ethan's stomach tightened. This was it. They were taking the plane. Before he could react, Kyle made his move. He shoved past one of the other men, forcing his way into the narrow cockpit. His shoulder collided with Ethan's, and the plane jolted slightly. The sudden shift in weight made Ethan's instincts scream. He reached for the controls, but Kyle's body was now blocking his every move, pressing him back against the side panel of the cockpit. Ethan cursed under his breath. There was no room to maneuver. The small space of the cockpit was now crowded with Kyle's bulk. "Get off me!" Ethan barked, his voice rising with the surge of adrenaline. He instinctively tried to shove Kyle away, but the younger man was relentless, his grip tightening on the back of Ethan's seat. "Do what I say, pilot," Kyle growled, his voice low and dangerous. The force of his grip on the seat back was enough to make the plane wobble again. For a split second, Ethan felt the plane shifting beneath him, but he immediately reached for the trim, adjusting the controls with swift precision to stabilize the altitude. The struggle intensified. Ethan's heart was racing, but his military training kicked in. The adrenaline, the pressure, it all melted away into cold focus. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not here, not now. His elbow drove into Kyle's ribs, and for a brief moment, he felt the man's grip loosen. But before Ethan could take full advantage, one of the other men, Mark, came into the cockpit, forcing himself in, blocking any chance of escape. "Let him go!" Ethan growled, but the man's body was too big, too heavy to move easily. Ethan cursed under his breath again. This was it. His only option was to play the long game, gain their trust, even if only for a few more moments, to find a way out. But as the tension continued to build, Ethan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about a simple flight anymore. It was about survival, and Ethan Davis wasn't going to lose. Ethan's mind raced as he sat locked in the cockpit, Kyle pressing hard against him, the plane jostling slightly under the added weight. He could feel every inch of his body reacting instinctively, muscles tense, every nerve alert. But his grip on the yoke remained steady. He could not afford to let this man have the upper hand. The voices from behind him were growing louder now, the other men moving around in the small cabin, shifting positions. Mark stood near the door, his eyes sharp, scanning the cockpit as though looking for a weakness. Ethan knew better than to show any signs of panic. He had to keep his cool, keep his focus, or he would lose control not just of the plane, but of the situation entirely. Kyle's knee pressed harder into Ethan's leg, a subtle attempt to pin him down. The smell of sweat and the faint scent of gasoline filled the small space between them. Ethan's thoughts turned to the most critical thing: control. If he lost control of the plane, They were all dead. The reality of that fact hit him like a slap in the face. "Listen, I'm just a pilot," Ethan said, his voice low and deliberate. "This isn't the kind of job you want to get involved with." Kyle chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "I'm not the one in control here, buddy." His voice was a low growl, as if daring Ethan to challenge him. "You're going to fly us wherever we tell you? And if you don't, well, things are going to get a lot worse for you." Ethan's grip on the yoke tightened further. He felt the sweat trickle down his back, the pressure mounting. This wasn't just about flying anymore. This was about staying alive. The hijackers had the numbers, but he had the skills. They had weapons, but Ethan had been through worse situations. He had been trained for moments like this, and he wasn't going down without a fight. "Make your move then," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "But I'm not going down easy." The words hung in the air like a challenge. But just as the tension was about to snap, Jack's voice cut through the cockpit, smooth and dangerous. "Enough, Kyle," Jack said. His tone wasn't angry. It was measured, controlled. "He's right. No need to make this any harder than it has to be. Get out of his way." Kyle hesitated, shooting one last glare at Ethan, his eyes full of rage. He backed away slightly, just enough to give Ethan some space, but the threat was far from over. The air in the cockpit still felt charged, like a live wire just waiting to snap. Ethan took a slow breath, willing his heart rate to return to normal. The adrenaline still surged through his veins, but he couldn't let it overwhelm him. He had to stay calm. He had to think. He had to wait for the right moment to act. As he adjusted the flight path slightly, ensuring that everything remained smooth and steady, his mind was working overtime, calculating their next moves. Every second counted. One wrong move, one misstep, and this could all come crashing down. He glanced in the rearview mirror that separated the cockpit from the cabin. Mark was still standing near the aisle, his eyes scanning the cockpit and then drifting over to the control panel. The guy was looking for an opening. Ethan could feel it. But the longer they looked, the more they were revealing their own weaknesses. "What do you think you're going to do, Ethan?" Jack's voice was quieter now, but it held a menacing undertone. "You think you're going to outsmart us?" Ethan met Jack's gaze through the mirror, his expression hardening. "I don't need to outsmart you. I just need to survive." For a long moment, Jack didn't respond. The silence between them felt like it stretched on forever, each second adding more weight to the tension. Ethan could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as he watched Jack's face. He couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. Jack was calculating something. Ethan could see it in his eyes. "I'm not interested in playing games, Ethan," Jack finally said, his voice sharp. "I'm here for one thing only, and if you get in my way, you're going to regret it." Ethan didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let Jack rattle him. Not now, not ever. His hands moved methodically over the controls, adjusting the plane's altitude by a few degrees. The aircraft responded smoothly, just as it always did. In that moment, the sudden sound of something shifting behind him caught his attention. Ethan's instincts kicked in, and he immediately turned his head slightly, catching the movement in the reflection of the cockpit's window. Without warning, Tyler, the shortest of the group, suddenly lunged forward. The air in the cockpit shifted with the speed of his movement, and before Ethan could react, Tyler's elbow slammed into his shoulder, driving him against the side panel of the cockpit. The plane jolted, its steady climb disrupted. Ethan's body automatically adjusted. He twisted in his seat, barely managing to prevent himself from losing his grip on the yoke. The plane rocked slightly, but Ethan was quick to make the necessary adjustments to keep them steady. "Damn it," he muttered, forcing Tyler off with a sharp shove. The cockpit was too cramped for this kind of physical struggle, but Ethan was no stranger to combat. His Air Force training kicked in, and he pushed back with all his strength, shoving Tyler away, trying to create enough room to regain control. "Get back," Ethan barked. His voice was sharp, the authority in it undeniable. "You want to crash this plane?" Tyler hesitated for just a second, but that was all Ethan needed. He adjusted the trim and stabilized the flight path again, but his focus was split between holding the plane steady and defending himself. The next few seconds would determine everything. But before he could act, he felt the pressure build in his chest again as Jack moved into the cockpit, stepping up behind Tyler. The man's eyes were cold, his body filling the small space like a looming shadow. "Let him fly, Kyle," Jack said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "We don't need him to make this harder." Kyle growled but stepped back, his anger palpable but restrained. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Jack," he muttered. "He's not just some guy off the street." Ethan kept his eyes on the horizon, taking deep breaths, his mind racing. He could hear the others shifting behind him, and the weight of their presence in the cramped cockpit pressed on him like a physical force. He could sense their frustration, their impatience. They were close to breaking, but Ethan knew it was not his time to make a move yet. He had to wait. The moment Jack's eyes met his in the rearview mirror, Ethan knew he was being tested. Jack wasn't just looking at him, he was trying to figure him out, looking for any sign of weakness. He would give Jack none. Ethan took another slow breath, his mind working through the possible outcomes. He could feel the tension in his body, the war between fear and determination. The stakes were high, but he wasn't going to let anyone take control from him. Not on his plane. The cockpit felt too small now, like the walls were closing in around Ethan. He could hear the subtle sounds of movement behind him, the shuffle of boots on the floor, and the low mutters of Jack's men. They were growing restless, their patience wearing thin. But Ethan remained focused, his eyes locked on the horizon, his hands steady on the yoke. He couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, not when everything depended on keeping control. Jack was still watching him, studying him like a hawk. Ethan didn't need to look to know that the other men were shifting their weight, preparing for the next move. It was only a matter of time before they escalated. He kept his voice steady, hoping to stall for as long as possible. "I told you before, I'm just here to fly you where you want to go. That's all, nothing more." Jack leaned closer, his cold stare never leaving Ethan's face. "You're a smart guy, Ethan. You know how to talk your way out of things. But this time, you don't get to talk. You don't have control anymore." Ethan felt the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He knew what Jack was trying to do, trying to break him mentally, to push him into a corner where he would comply without question. But Ethan had faced tougher situations than this. He had stared death in the face more than once, and he wasn't about to let some low-level criminal hijack his plane without a fight. "I'm still in control of this plane, Jack," Ethan said, his voice calm but unwavering. "And you're not going to change that." Jack's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Ethan thought he might strike. But then Jack just smirked, the expression cold and calculating. "We'll see about that." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the steady hum of the engines. Ethan's mind was working quickly, assessing his options. His military training was coming back to him in waves, strategies, tactics, things he had learned in the heat of battle. He wasn't just going to let these men win, not when he had everything to lose. He stole a quick glance at the fuel gauge. They were still well within range, but the clock was ticking. He needed to find a way out of this, and fast. That's when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a footstep behind him, followed by the distinct click of a gun being drawn. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Turn the plane around, Ethan." Jack's voice came from behind him, low and cold. "Now!" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment when things would either go completely wrong or he would find a way to turn the tables. He could feel the sweat dripping down his back, but his hands remained steady on the controls. He had flown through combat zones before. This wasn't the first time he had been in a life-or-death situation, and it wouldn't be the last. "I'm not changing the flight path," Ethan said firmly, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "You hired me for a job, Jack. I'm going to do it." Jack's voice came again, sharp and commanding. "I said turn the plane around, Ethan. Now." The gunshot that followed made Ethan's heart freeze in his chest. It was a warning shot, but it wasn't aimed at him. Instead, the bullet ricocheted off the panel next to him, sparking a brief flash of light. Ethan didn't flinch. He had seen worse. He had survived worse. But now the situation had changed. Jack wasn't just intimidating him anymore. The threat was real, and it was escalating rapidly. Ethan knew he had one shot at this, one chance to regain control. His military instincts kicked into overdrive. He could feel every movement in the plane, every subtle shift in the air, like he was connected to the aircraft in a way few people ever were. It was a feeling he had developed over years of flying under fire, years of training that had made him one of the best. He quickly scanned the instruments. The plane was still stable, but Jack and his crew were moving around now, creating chaos. Ethan needed to focus. He had to keep the aircraft level while he figured out a plan. "You don't want to do this, Jack," Ethan said, his voice lower now, more dangerous. "You're making a mistake." Jack's eyes narrowed as he took another step forward, the gun still raised in his hand. "The only mistake I'm making is letting you talk. Now shut up and turn this damn plane around." The sound of movement behind him told Ethan that the other men were closing in. Mark was coming forward, and Tyler wasn't far behind. This was no longer just a hijacking. This was a full-on takeover, and Ethan could feel the pressure mounting. His mind raced, but he kept his breathing even. One mistake, and it was over. "Ethan," Rachel's voice came from the back of the plane, sharp and urgent. "They're not just after the plane. They're after something bigger. We need to do something before they get us both killed." Ethan's heart skipped a beat at her words. He hadn't been able to fully process everything, but now he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about a group of thieves trying to steal a plane. This was something much more dangerous. Ethan's eyes flicked to the side, quickly scanning the cockpit. He had to buy himself some time. He had to think. He did what he had to do. He made a subtle adjustment to the throttle, sending the plane into a shallow dive. The sudden shift in altitude threw everyone off balance, causing a few of them to stumble. Mark reached for his weapon, but before he could get a shot off, Ethan swung the plane into a sharp roll, throwing everyone off their feet. The plane dipped, and the entire cabin jolted hard. Ethan could feel the weight shift as the momentum of the roll sent the men tumbling to the floor. This was his chance. With one quick motion, Ethan reached for the emergency release button under the console, opening the cargo hatch. He wasn't planning to open it fully, just enough to make them think he was giving up control. The sudden movement would confuse them, make them second-guess their next move. He was playing a dangerous game, but he had no choice. As the hatch creaked open, he adjusted the course slightly, just enough to give him room to maneuver. "You're not getting this plane, Jack," Ethan growled, his voice low and threatening. Jack's eyes locked onto him, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of hesitation. Jack had been confident up until now, but Ethan's sudden move had rattled him. The shift in momentum had thrown everyone off balance. Now it was Ethan's turn to be in control. The plane leveled out, the sudden roll and dive leaving the hijackers disoriented. But Ethan wasn't done yet. His heart was pounding in his chest, his grip tight on the controls as he calculated his next move. He had bought himself a few precious seconds, but he couldn't afford to waste them. The sound of boots scrambling in the cabin reminded him that the men were regaining their footing, and soon they would be back on him. This was his moment, his only moment to act. "Get that damn hatch closed!" Jack's voice rang out from behind him, sharp with anger. Ethan's eyes flicked to the instruments. Everything was stable again, for now. He had to make his next move count. The men were recovering, but they were disorganized, confused, and Ethan could exploit that. He had done it before, used the chaos of an emergency to his advantage. He wasn't about to let Jack and his crew take control now. The moment the hatch door creaked, he pulled back on the yoke, sending the plane into another hard left bank. The sharp turn threw the men off balance once more. But this time, Ethan wasn't giving them a chance to recover. He could hear them scrambling, their curses echoing in the small cabin. But he focused on the horizon. The last thing he needed was to lose concentration while Jack and the others tried to take him down. Out of the corner of his eye, Ethan saw Jack move, his figure filling the small partition between the cockpit and the cabin. Ethan's pulse quickened as the man's hand moved closer to his waistband. Jack was reaching for his weapon. Not this time, Ethan thought. With a calculated move, Ethan jammed the control yoke to the right, sending the plane veering hard in the opposite direction. It was just enough to break Jack's concentration, just enough to make him hesitate for a split second. Ethan didn't waste the opportunity. His knee slammed into the lower part of the control panel, sending the plane into a steep climb. The engines roared as the plane shot upwards, forcing the hijackers back into their seats. But that wasn't enough. Ethan's mind worked quickly. He had one shot at this. Jack was recovering. His hand was almost on the pistol. Ethan could feel it. With a swift glance at the side window, Ethan saw the reflection of Tyler moving toward the cockpit, his movements quick, precise, and filled with purpose. Ethan knew that Tyler wasn't as careful as Jack, but he was dangerous all the same. There was no time to waste. Ethan needed to make them think they had control, even though the opposite was true. "I'm not going to say it again," Jack called out, his voice tight with fury. "Turn this plane around or I'll end you." Ethan didn't flinch. His eyes locked on the control panel, calculating, running through options. He had been in tight spots before, and he knew exactly what to do. The moment Jack made his move, Ethan would act. Suddenly, Tyler lunged forward, shoving past Jack and into the cockpit. His hand reached for Ethan's arm, his grip as hard as iron. Ethan was ready for him. In one fluid motion, he shifted his weight and threw an elbow into Tyler's chest. The man staggered back, his grip loosening, just enough for Ethan to break free. Tyler stumbled, his boots scraping against the cockpit floor as he tried to regain his balance. That was all Ethan needed. He quickly pushed forward, slamming the trim control to the left. The plane banked sharply, throwing Tyler off balance once more. And before the man could react, Ethan swung his fist, catching him under the jaw. The blow sent Tyler crashing against the side panel, his body crumpling to the floor, momentarily stunned. But Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Without looking back, Ethan slammed the throttle forward, sending the plane into a steep dive. The sudden drop left the men scrambling for their seats as the plane's nose plunged toward the earth. It was a calculated move, but it was dangerous. Ethan had to fight the pull of gravity, regain control, and keep the plane stable before it was too late. The cabin erupted with shouts, but Ethan was calm, his hands working instinctively. His eyes never left the gauges. As the plane began to level off again, Ethan's heart rate returned to normal, his mind sharp and clear. He had done it. He had broken their momentum, thrown them off balance, and now he had a small window of opportunity. Jack was still standing, fury etched on his face, his gun still at his side. But there was hesitation in his eyes now. Ethan could see it. He could feel it. The man had expected to break him, to make him submit. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man who broke under pressure. Ethan steadied the plane, his breathing even now, as he glanced over his shoulder. Mark was still recovering, but the other two men were out of the equation for the moment. This was the opening Ethan had been waiting for. "You're not getting away with this," Jack hissed, stepping forward. But this time, there was a noticeable uncertainty in his voice. "I already am," Ethan shot back, his voice cold and calm. He wasn't rattled anymore. He had regained control and Jack could see it. He could feel the shift in power. Ethan tightened his grip on the yoke. "I don't care who you think you are, Jack. This plane is mine. You want it? You're going to have to take it from my cold, dead hands." Jack's eyes flashed. But for the first time since this whole thing started, Ethan saw doubt flicker across the hijackers' face. They had underestimated him. They had thought they were dealing with a simple civilian, someone they could push around, intimidate, and control. But they were wrong. "I'm not going to let you take my plane," Ethan said, his voice steady, unyielding. "Not today, not ever." A beat of silence passed. Jack's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking to his crew, and for a moment, it seemed like time had stopped. The entire cabin was frozen, waiting for someone to make the next move. Ethan didn't wait. He had to finish this. His hands shot forward, locking the autopilot into place. Then before Jack or the others could react, Ethan reached for the emergency landing gear release and triggered it. The plane jerked suddenly, the emergency release causing a sharp decline in altitude. The hijackers scrambled once more, the sudden shift in control catching them off guard. As the plane dipped, Ethan adjusted the throttle, pushing the engines to their limit. The plane was alive with the sound of roaring engines, but Ethan was calm. The hijackers were scrambling to regain control, but Ethan was already ahead of them. The plane swooped downward, closer to the ground, like a hawk descending on its prey. The world outside the cockpit window was a blur as Ethan shoved the yoke to the left, banking the plane sharply. The engine screamed as the aircraft descended, the G-force pressing Ethan against the seat. His heart pounded, but his mind was steady. Every move he made had to count. There was no room for hesitation. The hijackers were disoriented, but they were quick to recover. Jack, still standing in the aisle, his gun in hand, was barking orders at his men, trying to reassert control. But Ethan could see the fear creeping into Jack's eyes. They had underestimated him, thinking they were dealing with a civilian pilot, someone who would fold under pressure. Now they were faced with a man who had been trained for combat, who had flown through storms and war zones. "You think you can outrun me, Ethan?" Jack's voice cut through the cabin, cold and threatening. He had regained his composure, but his words were laced with frustration. "I don't need to outrun you, Jack," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "I just need to outsmart you." Ethan tightened his grip on the yoke, his fingers nearly white from the pressure. The plane's descent was controlled, but he had to act fast. His mind was racing. He needed to get them to a place where he could take control without risking the plane or their lives. The hijackers wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, but they were getting sloppy. Ethan had to take advantage of their growing panic. "Get him down," Jack roared, pointing the gun toward Ethan's seat. "You don't have a choice here. We'll make this go the easy way or the hard way. Your pick." Ethan didn't flinch. He kept his eyes ahead, scanning the horizon, looking for any advantage. His fingers moved across the controls with practiced precision. The plan was simple. He needed to force them into a position where they thought they were in control, just long enough to make his move. The plane dipped lower, and the sudden change in altitude caused a few of the men to lose their balance again. Mark stumbled, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself, while Tyler cursed loudly as he fought to stay on his feet. Ethan took a deep breath, adjusting the throttle, his hands moving fluidly across the controls. He could hear the hijackers muttering behind him, trying to make sense of what was happening, but Ethan had them right where he wanted them. Suddenly, Rachel's voice crackled through the intercom, sharp and urgent. "Ethan, you've got to get this under control. They've already made their move, and they won't back down. They're not just here for the plane, they want the cargo. Whatever it is they're moving, it's big. Don't let them get away with it." The realization hit Ethan like a jolt of electricity. He had known that something felt off about this flight, but now it was clear. This wasn't just a hijacking. These men were part of something much larger. They weren't after just the plane. They were after whatever it was they were transporting. And if they succeeded, it could mean disaster. Ethan's fingers flew over the controls, adjusting the altitude and speed, preparing for what came next. He couldn't let them win, not when the stakes were this high. Jack moved toward the cockpit, his gun raised and his eyes filled with rage. But Ethan was already 2 steps ahead. He adjusted the plane's heading, forcing it into a rapid right bank. The aircraft jolted sharply and Jack lost his footing, stumbling back toward the aisle. Ethan's mind raced, calculating the distance between them and the nearest airstrip. It was a small, remote location, but it was just close enough. He could make it there before Jack had time to recover. The odds were slim, but it was his only shot. The hijackers were scrambling. Mark and Tyler were trying to steady themselves, but the violent maneuver had thrown them off balance. Jack, his face twisted with fury, was still recovering from the jolt. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. He had to buy himself more time. He couldn't afford to let Jack or any of the others get control of the situation again. This was it. He had no choice but to finish this. "Stay down, Jack," Ethan muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. He needed to make his move, and he needed to do it now. With a steady hand, Ethan disengaged the autopilot. The plane's movements were now entirely in his control. He shot the plane into a steep climb, forcing the engines to work harder, creating a sudden sense of urgency. The rapid change in altitude disoriented the hijackers again, and they struggled to keep their footing. Ethan's eyes scanned the instruments, altitude, fuel, heading, everything in perfect sync. The hijackers were too focused on trying to regain control of the plane to realize that they had already lost it. Ethan was playing them like a fiddle, and they were too caught up in their own panic to see it. He pushed the throttle forward, sending the plane into a rapid descent. The sudden change in direction was enough to throw off the hijackers once more. And as the plane dipped closer to the ground, Ethan saw his opening. "Mark! Tyler! Get him!" Jack shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Take him down now!" But it was too late. Ethan had already positioned the plane perfectly, and just as Jack barked his orders, he yanked the yoke hard to the right, sending the plane into a sharp, controlled roll. The sudden motion threw the hijackers into chaos, their bodies tumbling to the floor as they struggled to regain control. Ethan kept his focus, pushing the plane through the roll with precision. The hijackers were no longer in control. Ethan had gained the upper hand. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the plane leveled off, Ethan could see the target in the distance. An old, remote airstrip. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot. He adjusted the controls, preparing for the final stretch. His mind was sharp, his body coiled with tension. But he had one thing the hijackers didn't: control. Jack was still trying to regain his footing, but he could see the realization in the man's eyes. He knew it was over. Ethan was flying them to their fate now. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the distant airstrip, his hands steady on the yoke as the Cessna Citation descended rapidly, cutting through the clouds and heading toward the narrow, forgotten runway. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his focus was razor sharp. The hijackers were still recovering from the chaotic roll, and their disorganization was his advantage. He had forced their hand, and now he needed to finish this. The engines hummed loudly, the plane's rapid descent filling the small cockpit with the noise of power and urgency. Ethan's grip tightened on the controls as the ground approached faster than he'd anticipated. He had calculated the landing perfectly, but there was always risk when flying in such conditions. The terrain below was uneven, the strip barely wide enough to accommodate the Citation's wings. Jack and his crew were still scrambling in the back, shouting orders at each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. They were still reeling from Ethan's last maneuver, the violent rolls that had thrown them into disarray. But it wouldn't take long for them to regroup, and when they did, they'd be dangerous. Ethan had to act quickly. "You're making a mistake, Ethan!" Jack's voice came from behind him, sharp and filled with anger. "We'll get you for this. Don't think you're getting away with it." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The plane was almost there, and he was going to land it. He had already made the decision. He couldn't let these men get away with hijacking his plane, especially when they were part of something bigger. The stakes were too high. As the ground rushed closer, Ethan pulled back slightly on the yoke, leveling the plane out just in time. The wheels of the plane hit the gravel runway with a loud thud, and the Cessna jolted violently. The impact rattled through the cabin, and Ethan's body was thrown forward against the straps. But he kept his grip on the controls, fighting the urge to flinch. The plane bounced once, then twice before the tires finally caught, and the aircraft screeched as it slid along the rough, uneven ground. "Hold it steady!" Rachel's voice came through the comms, tense but filled with purpose. She knew better than anyone what Ethan was capable of, and her calm voice grounded him as the plane skidded dangerously close to the edge of the strip. Ethan's knuckles whitened on the yoke as he fought to bring the plane under control. He couldn't afford to make another mistake, not now. The engines screamed as he pushed them into reverse thrust, trying to slow the plane down in time to stop before they ran out of runway. It was a close call. The plane screeched to a halt, mere feet from the edge of the trees. Ethan exhaled sharply, feeling the tension drain from his body. He had done it. He had brought them down safely, and now they were on solid ground. But the battle was far from over. Behind him, he could hear the shuffling of boots on the cabin floor. The hijackers were regaining their composure, their voices rising in anger. "Get him!" Jack yelled. "Tie him up! Don't let him get away!" Ethan didn't hesitate. He unstrapped his seatbelt, swinging out of the cockpit before they could make their move. He knew the area well. The strip was isolated, and there was no one around for miles. He had a few moments before they caught up with him. As Ethan made his way to the back of the plane, he pulled the emergency access panel open, reaching for the toolkit he had stashed under the seat. He didn't have much time, but he had to act fast. Suddenly, the roar of an engine cut through the silence outside. Ethan's eyes shot to the rear window of the plane. A black SUV was speeding down the gravel path, the headlights blinding in the dark. They were already coming for him. It wouldn't be long before they reached the plane. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, his mind racing. The SUV was heading straight for them, and he couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. He needed to think. He needed to find a way to stall them long enough to get back into the air. His eyes flicked to the cargo hold. He had an idea. It wasn't pretty, but it might work. Ethan grabbed a couple of cans of fuel from the back of the plane, carefully positioning them near the wing. He wasn't sure if it would work, but he needed a distraction. He wasn't going to let Jack and his men get away with this. Not when his plane, his freedom, was at stake. The SUV was getting closer, the headlights blinding as they bore down on the plane. Ethan knew they wouldn't just let him walk away. They wanted the plane, and they were going to take it one way or another. But he wasn't going to make it easy for them. Just as he was about to light the fuse to the fuel cans, he heard footsteps behind him. Jack and the others were on him. He didn't have much time. "Get away from my plane," Ethan shouted as he turned, swinging a wrench he grabbed from the toolkit at Jack's men. Tyler charged toward him, but Ethan was quicker. With a precise strike, he sent Tyler stumbling backward, a quick elbow to the face that left him dazed. But there was no time to revel in the small victory. "Stay the hell away from my plane," Ethan growled again, but this time his voice was more forceful. He wasn't letting anyone take this from him. He wasn't going to be the one to lose today. Jack's crew moved in quickly, but Ethan wasn't done yet. With one hand holding the wrench, he grabbed a flare gun from the cockpit, aiming it at the ground near the wing. He pulled the trigger, the loud shot echoing through the air as the flare shot out, lighting up the sky in a bright red arc. The hijackers hesitated. For a moment they were unsure, watching the flare sail into the sky, the bright light casting an eerie glow over the barren landscape. But the delay was enough. Ethan swung open the cockpit door and climbed back into the seat. His hands moved quickly, flipping the ignition switch and firing up the engines. Jack and his men were scrambling now, but Ethan wasn't waiting for them. As soon as the engines roared to life, he pushed the throttle forward, sending the Citation racing down the strip, its wheels gripping the gravel tightly. The black SUV skidded to a halt behind him, but it was too late. Ethan was already airborne. The plane shot into the sky with a swift surge, leaving the ground and the hijackers behind. He didn't look back. His heart was still racing, his hands tight on the controls, but his mind was clear. He had reclaimed his freedom, and he was going to make sure no one would take it again. The night sky stretched out before him, endless and open. The storm had passed, but Ethan knew it was far from over. He still had a fight ahead of him, but for now he was flying free, and that was all that mattered. Ethan pushed the throttle forward, the engines roaring as the Cessna Citation climbed higher into the night sky. The landscape below receded into darkness, but Ethan's mind was sharp, calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. He wasn't out of danger yet. He had regained control of his plane, but Jack and his crew were still out there, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. As the plane leveled off, Ethan adjusted his heading, setting a course that would take him far away from the remote airstrip they had just escaped. The engines hummed steadily, a constant rhythm that brought a sense of calm amidst the chaos of the last few hours. But the calm was fleeting. The distant roar of a second engine cut through the stillness of the night sky. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his heart sinking as he saw the headlights of the black SUV in the distance, now just a faint glow against the dark horizon. They were still chasing him. Ethan didn't hesitate. He reached for the radio, dialing into the emergency frequency. The last thing he wanted was to alert anyone, but he needed an edge. His fingers trembled slightly, but he forced himself to stay focused as he keyed in the emergency code, transmitting a signal that would trigger the radar systems of nearby air traffic control. It was a risk, but it was the only option he had left. The authorities wouldn't be able to do much. He wasn't sure who was really after him or how far up the chain this went, but at least they would have a record of his flight, something to track in case the situation turned ugly. He sat back in the cockpit, taking a deep breath, but the tension didn't let up. The SUV behind him was gaining. They weren't going to let up until they had the plane. "Rachel, what's the status back there?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice steady, though he could feel the anxiety building again. "I've got eyes on them, Ethan," Rachel replied, her tone calm but sharp. "They're not giving up. They'll catch up to us soon enough if we don't make a plan." Ethan's mind raced, calculating his options. He was flying low, trying to keep under the radar, but they had already locked in on his position. There was only one chance for him to escape with his freedom intact, and it wasn't going to be easy. "You see anything ahead?" Ethan asked, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was nothing but endless blackness in every direction, but Rachel had the best eyes in the business. If there was a way out, she would find it. "There's a patch of mountains up ahead," she replied after a pause. "I can see the ridge. Looks like a series of canyons. If we can make it there, we might be able to lose them. The terrain will give us a chance to shake them off." Ethan nodded to himself, feeling a flicker of hope. The mountains were a perfect natural barrier. The narrow canyons and sharp turns would give him the advantage, but it was also a risky maneuver. If he misjudged a turn, or if the SUV tried to follow, they'd be in a serious bind. "All right," Ethan said, flipping switches on the console, his fingers moving with practiced precision. "Get ready. This is going to get rough." The Cessna Citation surged forward, its engines screaming as Ethan pushed it to the limit. He banked sharply to the left, aiming toward the dark outline of the mountain range ahead. The plane felt alive in his hands, each movement calculated, the cockpit a second skin. The pursuit was on. They were coming for him. Behind him, the black SUV wasn't backing down. Ethan could hear the faint roar of its engine, growing louder as it closed the gap. He could almost feel the men inside, their eyes locked on him, knowing that if they didn't catch up soon, their opportunity would slip away. Ethan's knuckles turned white as he gripped the yoke. The ground was rising rapidly and he had to stay steady. The ridges ahead were jagged, their sharp peaks cutting into the sky. Ethan's mind was sharp. He had flown over this terrain before. He knew the turns, the cliffs, the sudden drops that could make or break a flight like this. "Stay low, stay sharp," Ethan muttered to himself. "Keep it together." The canyon walls rose on either side, and Ethan banked hard to the right, the plane tilting dangerously. The wind picked up, buffeting the wings, but Ethan kept the plane steady, following the narrow path through the rocky gorge. The air inside the cockpit felt thick with tension, and the sound of the engines seemed to reverberate off the canyon walls. Ethan glanced back. The headlights of the SUV were getting closer, but the narrow pass was working in his favor. The road ahead was twisting and turning, with sheer drops and tight corners. He pushed the plane harder, guiding it through the valley, his focus unwavering. Suddenly, a sharp turn ahead forced him to adjust quickly. The plane's nose dipped, and the aircraft felt like it was hanging by a thread. But Ethan's hand was steady on the controls. He adjusted the throttle, making minor corrections, and the plane leveled out, just in time to make the next turn. He glanced back once more. The SUV had followed him into the canyon, but it was struggling to maintain speed. The rough terrain was no match for the high-performance aircraft that Ethan was piloting, and he was gaining ground. But then, just as he thought he had shaken them, the sound of the SUV's engine roared closer. Tyler had clearly taken over the driving, and now he was pushing the vehicle to its limits, making the turns faster and more reckless. Ethan could see the headlights flashing in the reflection of the canyon walls. Dangerously close. Rachel's voice came over the comms, filled with urgency. "They're gaining again. They won't stop, Ethan. We need to end this now." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He knew what had to be done. The next canyon ahead was tight, dangerously so. The sharp, jagged walls of rock loomed on either side, with barely enough room for the plane to pass through. This was it. If he could get through this last stretch, the SUV wouldn't have a chance. They wouldn't be able to keep up in this terrain. "Rachel, hang on," Ethan said, his voice calm despite the rising tension. "I'm going to push this to the limit." Without another word, he banked sharply to the left, diving lower toward the jagged rocks. The plane screeched as it scraped the canyon wall, the metal groaning under the pressure. Ethan didn't flinch. He adjusted the trim and made another sharp right turn, narrowly avoiding a boulder that loomed out of the darkness. The SUV was still behind him, but it was struggling now. The rough terrain had caught up to them, and Ethan's maneuvering had pushed them just far enough behind. The headlights flickered as the SUV skidded on a loose patch of gravel, and Ethan pushed the throttle harder, taking the final stretch through the narrow gap in the canyon. Finally, as he rounded the last bend, the headlights of the SUV disappeared from view. Ethan let out a long breath, his chest tight with relief. He wasn't out of danger yet, but they were no longer on his tail. He banked the plane again, climbing back into the sky, his heart still pounding from the chase. The canyon was behind him, and the black SUV was just a fading memory in the distance. "Good job, Ethan," Rachel's voice came through, calm but filled with relief. "We lost them, but you're not done yet. You still have to get out of here." Ethan nodded, though he didn't speak. The night was still young, and he had a long way to go before he could breathe easy again. But for now, at least, he had won. Ethan's hands were still tight on the yoke as the Cessna Citation soared higher into the cool night air. The mountains were behind him, the black SUV and its dangerous passengers nowhere in sight. The immediate danger had passed, but he wasn't naive enough to think it was over. The plane was his for now, but he knew Jack and his crew wouldn't give up easily. They were part of something much bigger, and as much as Ethan had outsmarted them so far, he still had unfinished business. The radio crackled to life again, a familiar voice cutting through the static. "Ethan, it's Rachel. I've been running some numbers on their operation. These guys, this isn't just some low-level hijacking. They're working with a syndicate, moving big shipments under the radar. If they've got your plane, they're using it for something huge, and you can bet they won't stop until they get it back." Ethan's jaw tightened as he processed the information. He had suspected it all along. The hijackers hadn't been after the plane for its own sake. They had been using it to move something dangerous. He didn't know what it was yet, but he was about to find out. "I'm not letting them get it back," Ethan muttered under his breath, his voice low with resolve. The plane banked slightly as he adjusted his heading, aiming toward a secluded airstrip he had used once before. It wasn't much, just a small patch of runway in the middle of nowhere, but it was off the grid. If he was going to get the authorities involved, he needed to land somewhere safe and out of sight. The journey was long, the silence in the cockpit filled only by the steady hum of the engines. Ethan's thoughts were a whirlwind of plans, countermeasures, and escape routes. He knew what he was up against now. Jack and his crew weren't just thieves. They were part of a much larger, more dangerous operation, and if he didn't stop them, the consequences could be catastrophic. As the airstrip appeared on the horizon, Ethan's heart rate steadied. He had to make the landing count. The strip wasn't wide and the approach was tricky, but he was a skilled pilot, and he had flown through worse. The only thing that worried him now was what awaited him on the ground. "Rachel, stay alert," Ethan said as he began his descent toward the airstrip. "We're not alone out here." Rachel's voice came through clearly, calm but laced with concern. "I'm with you, Ethan. Just make sure you're ready for whatever comes next." Ethan nodded even though she couldn't see him. He had been in tight situations before, but this felt different. He wasn't just fighting to get his plane back anymore. He was fighting to stop something far worse, and he couldn't do it alone. The wheels of the plane hit the gravel runway with a jolt, the impact jarring but controlled. Ethan kept his focus as he braked, pulling the plane to a stop at the far end of the strip. His heart was racing again, but this time, it wasn't just the landing. It was the uncertainty of what would happen next. He powered down the engines, the rumbling noise gradually fading. The silence was deafening. Ethan grabbed the radio, flipping the switch to send a distress signal. He was hoping someone would hear it before Jack and his men caught up to him. And then he saw them. The headlights of a vehicle flickered in the distance, moving fast. Jack and his crew had tracked him here. The SUV skidded to a halt just as Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed the flare gun. He couldn't afford to waste any time. He grabbed a duffel bag from the back of the plane, stuffing it with essentials, tools, flare rounds, and anything that could be useful in a fight. If Jack and his men were coming for him, he wasn't going to be caught unprepared. "Rachel, I need you to get to the truck," Ethan ordered, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I'm going to hold them off." Rachel hesitated. "Ethan, no. We need to stick together. We get back in the air, and we leave this mess behind us." "I can't let them take the plane again," Ethan said firmly. "If I don't stop them here, they'll just keep coming. I'll buy you some time. You take the truck, get back to town, and get help." There was a pause on the other end. Then Rachel's voice came through, softer now. "Just don't get yourself killed, okay?" Ethan gave a small nod to himself, though he knew she couldn't see it. He moved quickly, stepping out of the cockpit and into the darkened airstrip. The distant headlights were closer now, cutting through the night like a predator closing in on its prey. He took a deep breath, his pulse pounding in his ears, and steadied himself. This wasn't just about flying anymore. It was about taking back what was his and keeping it. As the SUV pulled to a stop, the door swung open, and Jack stepped out, followed by Tyler and Mark. They weren't trying to be subtle now. They were coming for him, and they weren't going to let him escape a second time. "You think you're going to get away with this?" Jack shouted across the strip, his voice dripping with malice. "This plane is ours. You'll regret messing with us." Ethan didn't flinch. He stood tall, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wasn't about to let these men intimidate him. They had made the mistake of underestimating him before, and now they were going to pay for it. "I'm not giving up this plane, Jack," Ethan said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of years of experience. "Not now, not ever." Mark took a step forward, a cocky grin on his face. But Tyler was the one who made the first move. He charged at Ethan, but Ethan had already anticipated the attack. He sidestepped, letting Tyler rush past him, and then slammed his elbow into the back of the man's head. Tyler crumpled to the ground, but he wasn't out for good. Mark was already closing in. Jack had been watching the whole thing unfold, but he wasn't making a move yet. He was trying to figure out his next play. Ethan took the opportunity to draw the flare gun from his bag, pointing it directly at Jack. "This ends now," Ethan said, his voice low, menacing. He wasn't afraid of Jack. He wasn't afraid of any of them. They had tried to steal his plane, and now it was time for them to pay the price. Jack took a step back, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't say anything. He knew Ethan meant business. A sudden noise from the far end of the airstrip caught Ethan's attention, the sound of a truck revving its engine. Rachel was making her move. Jack's eyes darted toward the truck, then back to Ethan. For a moment, it looked like he was going to charge at him, but then his expression shifted. He realized the jig was up. He wasn't going to win this fight. "Get in the truck, Mark," Jack ordered, his voice harsh. "We're done here." Ethan watched them retreat, Mark stumbling as he tried to regain his balance. Tyler slowly getting back to his feet. But they weren't coming after him anymore. They had lost, and Ethan had won. As the SUV sped off into the distance, Ethan's breathing slowed, and he allowed himself a moment of relief. He had won the battle, but he knew the war was far from over. He turned to see Rachel driving the truck toward him, the headlights cutting through the darkness. He climbed into the passenger seat, his heart still racing. "You okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, let's go. We've still got work to do." As the truck rumbled away from the airstrip, leaving the darkened landscape behind, Ethan felt a sense of relief wash over him. The battle had been long, and the fight had been hard, but in the end, the plane was his, and no one was going to take it from him again. The night sky stretched above them, infinite and full of possibilities. The storm had passed, and the future was his to claim.